Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So three of you have asked me about the cross-examination of the doctor who treated George Floyd after he was taken to the county medical center. Anyway, listen to the cross-examination, it's very interesting, and also the re-examination of the same doctor. All right then, let me know what you're thinking at the end. Bye for now.
Good morning, Doctor.
Morning.
Thank you for being here today. I have a few follow-up questions for you, kind of picking up right where we left off. You were discussing hypoxia kind of being consistent with asphyxiation, right?
Correct.
Hypoxia is the lack of oxygen to the brain, correct?
Correct.
And there are many things that cause hypoxia that would still be considered asphyxiation, agreed?
Correct.
Drug use, certain drugs can cause hypoxia, agreed?
Yes.
Specifically fentanyl.
That's correct.
How about methamphetamine?
It can.
Combination of the two?
Yes.
All right. Now, you testified about certain things that happened during your care of Mr. Floyd. You were running all sorts of different tests. You used the
Ultrasound.
Ultrasound.
Yep.
Thank you. Used the ultrasound. You took some blood samples as well.
Correct.
And you took some blood gas samples as well. Correct?
Correct. From the blood samples. Yes.
Right. So can you explain what the blood gas samples are?
So the blood gas samples are analyzing different parts of the blood, specifically looking at the pH or how acidic or basic the blood is, looking at the amount of oxygen in the blood, the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount of bicarbonate.
And carbon dioxide levels in this case were pretty high, weren't they?
Correct.
Do you recall what the carbon dioxide level was in the blood gas sample you initially took?
I believe the initial blood gas sample I took was a venous blood gas sample, which is less preferable as opposed to an arterial blood gas sample. At the time, I believed it was a venous sample, and I believe the CO2 level in that sample was around 100.
Okay. A little over 100 perhaps?
Yeah.
And that indicates an exceptionally high carbon dioxide level, agreed?
That, yes.
What would the average, for a healthy person, and you did a blood gas sample, what would you expect the CO2 or carbon dioxide level to be?
For a healthy individual without any sort of lung disease, you would expect somewhere between 35 and 45.
Okay. And so Mr. Floyd's carbon dioxide level was more than 2 times what you would normally expect.
Correct.
Now, the reason that you're doing these blood gas samples is in part to help you analyze and figure out courses of care, agreed?
Yes.
And that's the carbon dioxide number that we're talking about is essentially, that would be indicative of a person who is not eliminating the carbon dioxide, right? For it to go that way?
Correct. For it to be high in the blood, that means that they are therefore not eliminating it through ventilation or breathing.
And that points to a possible respiratory problem, right?
It can, yes.
And that increase in a carbon dioxide from a 35 to 45 to over 100, that takes some period of time in order to climb that high.
Yes, it can happen relatively quickly depending on how severe the ventilation problem is, but
it could take 30, 40, even an hour to climb that high.
it could take that long. It could take much less time, yes.
The use of fentanyl, do you know that to attribute to high carbon dioxide levels?
It can cause high carbon dioxide levels because it depresses the ventilation or the breathing.
So when someone ingests fentanyl, it can cause them to feel very sleepy because of an increased carbon dioxide level. Agreed?
Correct.
And that's one of the reasons ultimately that fentanyl is so dangerous, because it suppresses the respiratory system. Agreed?
The primary reason it is so dangerous. Yeah.
Now, you testified that when the paramedics gave their report to you, they did not give you any reference as to potential drug use, correct?
Correct.
They did not tell you that they had administered Narcan or naloxone during their care, correct?
Correct.
And during the course of your care of Mr. Floyd, you did not administer Narcan or naloxone, did you?
No.
And when you talk about those drugs that are immediately able to reverse the effects, that's what that does. Narcan reverses the effects of fentanyl toxicity. Agreed?
Correct.
When someone has a high carbon dioxide level, that causes that person to have a sensation of shortness of breath. Agreed?
Yes.
And that can happen to a person even without stress complicating their body, right? That respiratory, that feeling of an inability to breathe.
Yes.
Are you familiar with the impact of taking certain narcotics rectally?
Yes.
And that ultimately can provide a more powerful or rapid onset of an impact, right?
Yes.
Simply because a person has a history of chronic opiate abuse, does that mean that fentanyl can't kill them?
No.
When someone is hyperventilating, anxious and hyperventilating, they're actually decreasing their CO2 by doing that, correct?
Correct.
Some of the considerations that you have to take also would be the potential occlusion of a coronary artery, right?
Yes. In cases of cardiac arrest, yes.
And someone who has greater than a 75% occlusion of the right coronary artery, that poses a particular risk of fatal ventricular cardiac arrhythmia, does it not?
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
George was not happy with the question and the prosecution objected. The judge withdrew the question and the defense carried on.
All right, last question's withdrawn. Ask a new question.
Only a physician can declare a person dead, correct?
Depends where you're practicing.
In the state of Minnesota,
Yes.
a paramedic can't declare a person dead.
No, not without consultation with a physician.
So just to, based on your treatment, again, of Mr. Floyd, based on these tests that you did, had an elevated CO2 level, correct?
Yes.
And that CO2 level was considered to be exceptionally high, correct?
Correct.
And you did not, in the course of your consideration, provide naloxone or Narcan.
No.
And it would be, is it fair to say that the administration of Narcan, if you do not have opiates in your system, is a safe procedure?
Yes.
And if you do have opiates in your system, the administration of Narcan could be life-changing, life-saving.
Yes, not in this case.
Prior to the, but again, the paramedics, also based on your information, did not administer Narcan.
Correct. Can I make a clarification?
I'm good. No,
No.
there's no question.
They wish.
Basic, I'm sorry?
Direct if they wish.
And you would agree that Mr. Floyd arrived at HCMC at approximately 8:53? If we have seen evidence previously.
That sounds correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Can I make a clarification?
I'm good. No,
No.
there's no question.
They wish.
Basic, I'm sorry?
Direct if they wish.
And you would agree that Mr. Floyd arrived at HCMC at approximately 8:53? If we have seen evidence previously.
That sounds correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor.
For starters, Dr. Langenfeld, there was an answer you wanted to clarify. Please do so.
Only to state that Narcan, administering Narcan to someone who potentially suffered a fentanyl overdose, once that individual is in cardiac arrest, the administration of Narcan would provide no benefit.
And Mr. Floyd was obviously in cardiac arrest.
Correct.
You were asked questions just now about whether fentanyl works by causing someone to feel very sleepy. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
Did the paramedics tell you that Mr. Floyd was ever asleep or sleepy or anything that sounds like sleep?
The report that I received was that the patient, Mr. Floyd, was unresponsive on their arrival and did not have a pulse. So there was no report that he had been sleepy or difficult to arouse per se.
You were asked quite a number of questions about the carbon dioxide content in the blood gases. First off, if a person is suffering from hypoxia, that is oxygen deficiency, is that an explanation for a heightened carbon dioxide content in the blood?
It can be in severe cases.
In this case, do you find that the carbon dioxide reading for Mr. Floyd is really all that significant?
I felt that it was weak evidence in support of what I was thinking at the time. What's difficult in cases of cardiac arrest is once someone has been in cardiac arrest for an extended period of time, essentially the blood gas that I obtained could be consistent with cardiac arrest from any number of causes. You expect the pH to be low during cardiac. I'll provide a little bit of explanation on that. During cardiac arrest, there's no blood flow to the tissues, therefore there's no oxygen getting to the tissues. Therefore, the cells will die. They'll release hydrogen ions, which lower the pH, creating an acidic environment. They'll release lactate, which complicates that further. Because the person's heart has stopped from whatever cause, they'll no longer be breathing either. And so you would expect that their CO2 to be high. Again, it can vary a little bit depending on the cause, but in my estimation, the blood gas in this case wasn't very strong evidence for one cause over another as far as the etiology of the arrest.
And it was simply consistent with the fact of cardiac arrest,
Correct.
the fact that the heart had stopped.
Correct. And I felt that the high CO2 may have suggested a respiratory cause.
Now, you were asked questions about somebody administering narcotics interrectally. Remember those questions?
Yes.
Did you get any indication that Mr. Floyd had administered narcotics interrectally?
I had no information to suggest that.
Dr. Langenfeld, thank you.
Any further? Thank you, doctor. You may step down.
I really like the way this expert gave his evidence. At the end of the day, he's an expert. He owes a duty to the court, and it was yes, no, and even when he was asked not to speak further, he didn't answer the question, you know. He didn't turn around and say, oh, I do have more to say. He said, can I clarify the question or the answer? And basically he was given another opportunity to do so when the prosecution came to re-examine. His evidence is very useful to the court, but then he didn't, you know, force it on the prosecution or the defense. He was just basically saying that George died as a reason of oxygen deficiency as opposed to a heart attack. And this is a statement which supports the prosecution's case that George died as a result of excessive force used by the police. But he wasn't hammering it, you know, and sounding all biased. He was very professional, the way he spoke, and I think we've gotten as much information as we want concerning the drugs in George's body and the fact also that there was force used. It just leaves everything on the fence. Like I said to one of the subscribers, drugs are definitely not good to use, and George had a past, but it doesn't necessarily affect this case because this case is not about George's past. He's not the one on trial. It's about his death. Do not forget to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know what you're thinking. Bye for now.